Formal record of assessment. Isolation protocol application, subject designation, human/intake ref, 7 SORA 19. Processing station Vorth 9, containment block SORA 7. Assessor, Sarat Divan Olam, field grade 4. Filed under, restricted command eyes only. I am writing this record because I am required to. That is the first thing I want stated clearly, so that whoever reads this after me understands the disposition behind every word that follows. I did not request this assignment. I did not design the protocol I was asked to administer. I administered it as written, logged what I observed as trained, and I am now filing this account because the protocol produced results that are, in my professional judgment, inexplicable within the framework I was given, and because the relevant data does not exist anywhere in the station's standard intake logs. It exists only in what I watched in person across 9 days, and in the single conversation at the end of those 9 days that I also watched, and that I have thought about nearly every hour since. Let me begin with the subject. She arrived at Vorth 9 in the third intake wave following the corridor skirmishes. I did not witness her arrival. By the time I was assigned her case, she had already been processed through standard biometric cataloging, initial health screening, and the brief orientation interview that all human prisoners receive upon intake. The orientation interview exists to establish a baseline for future comparison, how the subject speaks, how their reasoning presents itself under mild administrative pressure, how they respond to structured questioning delivered in a neutral institutional register, so that later, after protocol deployment, we can measure what has degraded and by how much. The comparison is usually, in my experience, quite stark. The technician who conducted her orientation interview logged the following observations in the case file. I am reproducing them verbatim, because they become relevant to later entries. Subject is female-gendered adult, estimated mid to late third decade of biological development by human standards. Physical condition, functional. Minor lacerations consistent with capture circumstances. No acute injuries requiring medical intervention before protocol deployment. Cognitive baseline, high. Verbal fluency, high. Affect, flat. She answered every procedural question without resistance, without visible distress, without any attempt to negotiate, bargain, or appeal to anything outside the immediate exchange. She made no requests. She asked no questions. When informed she would be held pending assessment, she nodded once. When informed that her cooperation would be noted and weighed accordingly in any subsequent determination, she said, and I am quoting from the audio capture, "I understand." That was the complete interaction. Duration, 11 minutes. Assessment. Subject appears oriented, rational, and unremarkable. Unremarkable. That word appears in the original log. I have thought about it since. I do not think the technician meant anything particular by it. It was a standard intake evaluation and she behaved like a cooperative prisoner. From the outside, there was nothing to flag. She answered the questions, she accepted the information, she did not cause trouble. Unremarkable. I reviewed her biometric file before beginning the protocol. Humans run warm by galactic standards. Their core body temperatures are higher than optimal for most known species, and they metabolize at rates that seem, from an engineering standpoint, almost profligate. Their cardiovascular pressure is, to our physicians, bizarrely elevated as a baseline, as though they were designed to run at a permanent low-level emergency. Their neurological conductance speed falls roughly in the middle of the known range. Not the fastest, not the slowest, nothing in the scans that suggests extraordinary sensory or cognitive capability beyond what any competent species might exhibit. There are extensive notes in the shared xenobiological database about their immune systems, their bone density, their drug metabolism profiles, and their unusual cardiovascular resilience, but those were not relevant to my assignment. My assignment was the isolation protocol. I had administered the isolation protocol 41 times across 11 different species. I understood it well. I understood it, I believed, completely. The isolation protocol works as follows. The subject is housed in a containment cell designed to produce total sensory uniformity. The cell is kept at a precise mid-range temperature, not uncomfortable, not pleasant, simply neutral, engineered to provide neither the stimulation of cold nor the relaxation of warmth. The lighting is adjusted to a fixed, low, even ambient illumination that does not vary. There are no shadows, no variations in light level, no change across any surface that might allow the subject to track the passage of time by watching light move. There are no sounds above a flat white noise floor that exists only to fill the acoustic space and eliminate contrast, to take away the micro variations in silence that the brain normally uses to calibrate where it is and when. There is, as a consequence, no way to determine the passage of time from within the cell through any normal sensory channel. The subject receives nutritional delivery on a schedule that is itself randomized, enough to prevent physical deterioration, irregular enough that the body cannot establish a feeding rhythm and use it as a clock. Sleep prevention is maintained by low-level electrochemical floor stimulation, a mild repeating current, not painful, that delivers just enough neural interference to prevent the body from descending into the sleep states that neurological repair and memory consolidation require. The purpose of the protocol is not torture in the traditional sense. I want to be precise about this, because I know how it sounds on paper, and I know that whoever reads this record may bring assumptions about what it was designed to do. It does not cause physical pain. It does not threaten or physically harm the body. What it does is methodically and completely remove every external reference point the mind uses to orient itself in time, in space, and in the continuity of its own experience. It makes the interior of the cell the totality of the subject's world, and that interior contains nothing that changes. No rhythm, no event, no marker, no response. The mind, deprived of external input and denied the restorative architecture of sleep, turns inward. And what it finds there, eventually, is the raw, unmodulated signal of its own processes, which, unfiltered, untethered, and increasingly degraded by sleep debt, is not a pleasant or survivable experience. In most species, the first stage of the protocol's effect is restlessness. Physical agitation, inability to be still, compulsive movement. The second stage is anxiety, the physiological expression of a mind that is beginning to notice it cannot find its footing in time or space. The third stage is cognitive fragmentation, the point at which the subject's reasoning begins to lose coherence, where thoughts cannot complete themselves, where the thread connecting one moment to the next begins to fray. The fourth stage, which in most species arrives somewhere between 40 and 60 hours of protocol exposure, is what we designate dissolution, the point at which the subject's internal sense of continuity, of time, of self as a coherent entity moving through experience, breaks apart. Once dissolution is reached, the subject becomes cooperative in a way they never would have been at intake, not because they are coerced in any direct sense, because the version of them that would resist has ceased to cohere. There is no longer a unified center of will available to maintain resistance. There is only something fragmented and frightened, and in that state, willing to say anything that brings relief. The protocol typically runs no more than 72 hours. It is effective within 72 hours in 100% of tested cases across 11 species. I want to be precise about that. 100%. Not 95, not approximately all, every tested case, across 11 different species with differing neurological architectures and differing sleep physiology. The fastest dissolution I have documented personally was at 33 hours. The slowest was at 69. The median time to dissolution in my personal case record, computed across 41 administrations, is 51 hours and some fraction. When I say the protocol has a 100% success rate, I mean that no individual in my professional experience, and no species in the broader institutional record I was given access to before this assignment, has remained cognitively intact past 72 hours of the protocol. No one had ever reached hour 72 without dissolution. I logged day 0 at the moment I confirmed the subject was locked into SORA 7 and the protocol systems had activated. Then I went to my observation station and began to wait. Day 1, first monitoring window, 18 hours after lockdown. I reviewed the cell footage, which captures the space from 3 different angles and stores in continuous loops that I can access and annotate in real time. At 18 hours, the subject was sitting on the floor of the cell, not on the sleeping surface, which is slightly elevated from the floor, but on the floor itself, cross-legged. Her posture was straight. Her eyes were open. She was not moving. She appeared by the footage alone to be in no particular distress. Her biometric readout showed elevated heart rate, which I attributed to the baseline cardiovascular profile that characterizes human physiology and normal respiration. No motor agitation was present. No verbal output above the white noise floor. This was not unusual for hour 18. The first stage, restlessness, typically presents between hours 12 and 24 in most species. Some subjects skip it entirely. She was sitting still, which was in fact slightly calmer than average for this stage. I noted in the log, subject resting, no distress indicators, protocol proceeding normally. Day 1, second monitoring window, 36 hours. She was on her feet and walking. The cell is 3 meters by 4 meters, which is standard specification for this containment block. She was not pacing in the short, tight, agitated manner characteristic of stage 1 restlessness in most species. She was walking slowly, in a deliberate pattern, back and forth across the long dimension of the cell, consistent rhythm, consistent stride length, maintaining a pace that looked measured rather than driven. Her lips were moving slightly. The audio pickup registered nothing above the white noise floor, which meant her vocalizations were very low, below the threshold the equipment was set to capture. She was speaking to herself, quietly and consistently, and I could not determine what she was saying or whether it had structure. I noted subject ambulatory, subdued self-vocalization, early stage 1 behavioral indicators possible, protocol proceeding normally. I want to note, looking back at this entry, that it was wrong in a way I did not understand at the time. I called it early stage 1 indicators because she was moving and vocalizing, and those are stage 1 behaviors in other species. The mistake was in the assumption that the behavior meant the same thing in her that it means elsewhere. In other species, movement and self-talk at this stage are expressions of agitation, the body expressing the mind's restlessness as it loses its anchoring. I assumed her movement was the same. That assumption was not correct. Day 2, first monitoring window, 52 hours. She was sitting again, same floor position, cross-legged, straight back. Her eyes were closed now. I checked the biometrics immediately, because closed eyes at 52 hours could mean the floor stimulation had failed. It had not failed. She was not asleep. Her vital signs were stable at the slightly elevated cardiovascular baseline that appears to be normal for her species. She appeared, to a visual reading, to be resting in something like a meditation state, not asleep, but not in any visible distress either. At 52 hours, every other subject I have documented has shown clear dissolution indicators. The Kavath subjects begin showing incoherent speech. The Harath show motor agitation so severe that they sometimes injure themselves against the cell walls. Every subject I have processed shows, at a minimum, serious disruption of the calm behavioral effect that characterized them at intake. At 52 hours, this subject was sitting on a cell floor with her eyes closed and her breathing even. I noted dissolution not yet present, subject displaying anomalous behavioral stability at hour 52, extending monitoring interval, Protocol proceeding, notation pending. The phrase notation pending was my shorthand for flagging to myself that something about this case warranted closer attention. I did not, at the time, fully register what kind of attention it was going to require. Day 2, second monitoring window, 68 hours. She was walking again, same slow, deliberate back and forth. Her lips were still moving. I used the audio enhancement filter and suppressed the white noise floor just long enough to capture a brief sample of her vocalizations. The capture was imperfect. Perhaps 40% of syllables were recoverable, but it was sufficient to identify structure. She was not ranting. She was not praying. She was not appealing to anything in the distressed emotional register that I would expect from a subject at the edge of dissolution. She was speaking in a measured, organized cadence, with pauses, with what sounded like revisions or corrections inserted mid-thought, with the particular rhythm of someone building an argument. It took me several replays to be sure of what I was hearing, because I was not expecting to hear it. At 68 hours of the isolation protocol, I expected to hear fragmentation. I heard the opposite. I heard a mind working, carefully and methodically through something. I could not determine the content. Her language, the particular dialect or register she used, included technical vocabulary that my translation unit could not parse in full, but the shape of what she was doing was legible even without the meaning. Statement, pause, revision, continuation, backing up, restatement with a correction, building from one point to the next. She was conducting an internal seminar with herself, and she was doing it at 68 hours of enforced wakefulness in a cell designed to make that impossible. I noted, subject demonstrates intact higher cognitive function at 68 hours. No dissolution indicators present, no stage 3 fragmentation, behavioral assessment, anomalous, requesting secondary review of case file. I was hoping that a secondary reviewer would find something in her biometric readings or in the protocol log that I had missed, something that explained why the 68-hour window looked the way it looked. No one responded to the secondary review request before the next monitoring window. I noted the lack of response and continued alone. Day 3, first monitoring window, 84 hours. At 84 hours, the isolation protocol is normally complete. I do not typically schedule a monitoring window at 84 hours because there is, under normal circumstances, nothing to observe. The subject has dissolved. The recovery sequence has been initiated. The interview preparation is underway. I have never, before this case, needed to check on a subject at 84 hours because no subject has ever been in a cell at 84 hours. I scheduled this window because I needed to see what was there. At 84 hours, she was lying on her back on the floor, not on the sleeping surface, the floor again, the hard, flat surface. She was staring at the ceiling. Her biometrics confirmed she was not asleep. She was awake. She was horizontal, and she was looking at the ceiling with a quality of attention that I could not characterize as blank or vacant. She had been awake for 84 consecutive hours. For context, the cavith, the species I have processed most frequently in my career, reach complete cognitive dissolution at a median of 31 hours. At 50 hours, a cavith subject will show complete dissociation of short-term and long-term memory integration. They cannot connect what just happened to what happened an hour before. At 80 hours, the cavith brain is producing false sensory inputs so severe and so continuous that the subject cannot distinguish hallucinated experience from real experience. The harith, whose neurological architecture is in several ways closer to the human profile than the caviths, show dissolution at a median of 44 hours. Their maximum documented protocol tolerance in the institutional record is 61 hours. That is the longest any harith has lasted before dissolution. The Shendavat, who are regarded as among the most physiologically resilient species we process at this facility, reached dissolution at a median of 58 hours. Their record is 70 hours. That was the highest single-species tolerance I was aware of before this case. She was lying on the floor at 84 hours, staring at the ceiling, and when I increased the audio pickup to near maximum sensitivity and held it for several seconds, she said quietly to herself, or to whatever thought she was in the middle of, 2 words. My translation unit rendered them as roughly equivalent to, "Not quite." I cannot say with certainty what she was responding to. I do not believe she knew anyone was listening. I think she was talking to an internal argument. She was disagreeing with her own previous conclusion, at 84 hours. I closed the monitoring window and remained at my station for some time before writing the log entry. I noted, subject awake and behavioral indicators consistent with active cognition at hour 84. No dissolution observed. No fragmentation. Biometrics indicate elevated fatigue markers but stable cardiovascular and motor function. Assessment: unprecedented. Day 3, second monitoring window, 96 hours. She was walking. I need to record the precision of what this looked like, because the precision is the point. At 96 hours without sleep, in a cell designed to produce dissolution at 72 hours, she was standing upright with her weight balanced, walking in her measured pattern, and her eyes were fully focused. Not glassy, not unfixed, not doing the slow, sightless sweep that characterizes a sleep-deprived consciousness in most species. She was looking at the far wall, and she was tracking it as she moved, maintaining spatial orientation across the traversal. Her gaze had direction and intent. She was also counting her steps. I could see her lips moving in a small, regular pulse, 1 syllable per stride, consistent. She was keeping a running total of her laps. She was maintaining a number in her head, updating it continuously, across what must have been several hours of walking, so that she would not lose track of how much physical movement she had completed. She was monitoring herself. She was applying a management framework to her own physical condition, gathering data on her own performance, presumably to track it against some internal baseline she had established. I called the station medical officer and described what I was observing without using the official channel. I did not want to put this into the formal record until I had some framework for understanding it. I described the protocol duration, the behavioral observations, and the biometric readings as they stood. The medical officer said, "How long has the human been in the cell?" I told him. He was quiet. Then he said, "That's not possible. Their sleep threshold, the point at which severe neurological degradation onset begins, is around 72 hours by every model we have. Nobody has tested beyond that because the protocol doesn't run that long. There's no data beyond 72 hours. I said, "I am telling you what I am observing." He said, "I'll pull her biometric logs." He called back about 20 minutes later. He said, "Her cortisol analogs are elevated. Her inflammatory markers are slightly elevated and climbing slowly. Her neurotransmitter profile shows fluctuation in several bands, but I want to caveat that our calibration for human neurochemistry isn't precise. We're working from approximations and the margins are wide." He stopped for a moment. "Her cardiovascular system is stable. Her motor function is stable. She is biochemically, measurably, genuinely tired. The chemistry is absolutely consistent with significant sleep deprivation. But her behavioral profile doesn't match what the chemistry should be producing." I said, "What should the chemistry be producing?" He said, "At 96 hours by their own physiological literature, severe perceptual disruption, inability to maintain coherent reasoning, motor coordination declined significant enough to be obvious, significant emotional dysregulation." He paused. "She should be showing all of that." I said, "She is counting her laps." He said, "I know." Neither of us said anything for a moment. I noted in the log, Station medical officer consulted. Chemical indicators confirm significant sleep deprivation consistent with protocol duration. Behavioral indicators do not conform to expected clinical presentation of same. No framework available within current institutional knowledge to account for the discrepancy. Protocol outcome remains anomalous. Extending observation. Day 4, monitoring window, 112 hours. She had stopped talking to herself. The cell felt different in the monitoring footage. Not that any physical property of it had changed, but the quality of her silence within it was different from the silence of the first 2 days. Early in the protocol, subjects who go quiet are often quiet in the hollow way that precedes stage 3 fragmentation. The silence before dissolution is a particular kind of silence. It has an absent quality. Her silence at 112 hours was not absent. She was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, eyes open, looking at her own hands, not examining them in the compulsive fixation that sometimes accompanies late-stage deprivation states, not picking at them or holding them with the trembling grip of someone who has lost motor confidence. She was looking at them the way a craftsperson looks at a tool before using it, assessing the current state of something she relies on. She turned them over, palm up, palm down, spread the fingers, closed them into fists, opened them again. She extended each hand and watched the steadiness of the extension. Then she set them on her knees and looked at the wall. She was running a motor function test on herself. I noted, subject conducting self-assessment of motor function at 112 hours. No tremor observable in footage. Finger extension steady. No gross deterioration in fine motor coordination. Subject appears to be systematically checking her own condition. Day 5, first monitoring window, 126 hours. I had been expecting dissolution for 30 hours beyond its scheduled window. I had been telling myself at each monitoring check that the next window would show the break, that the break was coming, that the break was simply delayed, perhaps by some idiosyncratic feature of her particular neurological architecture that was slowing the standard progression. By day 5, I stopped believing the break was coming on any timeline I could predict. At 126 hours, she had moved to the sleeping surface. She was lying on her back, one arm across her stomach, one arm at her side, and she was not asleep. The biometrics confirmed it, and the floor stimulation was still active. But she was not moving, and her breathing had slowed toward a pattern I had not seen her use before. Long, deliberate inhalations, controlled exhalations, a respiratory rhythm that was clearly intentional, clearly not her resting pattern, clearly designed to produce a specific physiological effect. She was trying to rest as efficiently as possible without sleeping. More precisely, she had apparently determined at some point during the preceding hours how the sleep prevention mechanism of the cell worked. The floor stimulation operates at a frequency and intensity calibrated to prevent sleep state transition while not producing any response that most species consciously register as discomfort. Most species subject to the protocol are not aware of the mechanism at all. They simply cannot sleep, and they do not understand why, and this incomprehension becomes part of the disorientation. This is by design. She was lying on the sleeping surface above the floor, in the one position in the cell where the floor stimulation had reduced contact and therefore reduced effect, using a respiratory pattern that appeared intended to maximize the recovery available without crossing into sleep. She had deduced the mechanism from the sensation in the floor, from the physiological response of her own body reaching toward sleep and being turned back, from whatever understanding she had of the technology she was inside, and she had found the closest available approximation to rest within the system's constraints. I noted, subject behavior suggests active adaptation to protocol mechanisms. She appears to have identified the sleep prevention system and is positioning herself to minimize its effect while remaining within the cell's parameters. She is optimizing her rest profile. This is unprecedented in my case record. Day 5, second monitoring window, 142 hours. She had changed her walking pattern. The long, slow, back-and-forth traversals had been replaced by a shorter circuit around the perimeter of the cell, a loop that kept her in motion while covering less ground and requiring less energy per unit of time. She had shortened her stride. She had reduced her pace. She was no longer walking to maintain wakefulness or to manage restlessness. She was walking to preserve something. She was conserving. She understood, apparently, that she was in a long engagement, and she was adjusting her resource usage to match. At 142 hours, she looked directly at the monitoring camera in the northeast corner of the cell. It was not an accidental glance. Subjects who do not know they are being watched sometimes let their gaze drift across a camera without registering it. This was not that. She turned her head to a precise angle, found the camera, and held the look for 4 seconds with the particular quality of attention that means, I am aware this is here, I am aware this is being watched, and I want whoever is watching to know that I know. She was communicating something, though I could not determine the content of the communication beyond the basic acknowledgement. Then she turned and continued her circuit. I noted, subject is aware of monitoring. Her response to the camera was neither a plea nor a performance. She acknowledged it and continued. She is not distressed by observation. She may have decided at some point in the previous days that being observed is simply part of the situation she is in and adapted to it accordingly. Day 6, monitoring window, 160 hours. I called the medical officer again that evening. I said, at what point does extended sleep deprivation in a human become irreversible, permanent neurological damage? He said, irreversible how? What kind of damage? I said, permanent functional impairment, the kind you don't recover from. He pulled up his references. I could hear the interface sounds as he navigated. He said, there are documented cases in human scientific literature of individuals deprived of sleep for extended periods, voluntarily mostly, in research contexts or record attempt contexts. The longest verified cases run into the range of 11 days, perhaps slightly beyond. None of the subjects in those cases suffered permanent brain damage. There was significant cognitive impairment during the period, confusion, perceptual disruption, emotional instability, difficulty with complex reasoning. But they recovered. The published accounts describe full or near full recovery following adequate sleep. I said, she has been awake for 160 hours. He said, I know. I said, 11 days. Their maximum documented voluntary deprivation is 11 days. We are approaching day 7. Does she show permanent impairment indicators? He said, I want to be careful about this. He paused. Her neurotransmitter profile continues to fluctuate. Her inflammatory markers are elevated and continue to climb slowly. She is, by every chemical measure I can apply with our equipment, sleep-deprived to a degree that should be producing significant symptoms. And there are some behavioral indicators that suggest it is having an effect. The hallucination episode you logged, the slight movement unevenness in the day 9 footage. I said, that was day 8. I haven't filed day 9 yet. He said, right. But her behavioral coherence has remained substantially intact at every window you've reported. And her biometrics don't show the cascade pattern, the self-amplifying deterioration loop, that you'd expect if she were approaching a threshold event. She's not getting dramatically worse. She seems to be. He stopped. I said, what? He said, she seems to be absorbing it. I noted in the log, medical consultation at 160 hours. Officer's assessment. Subject is absorbing the cumulative sleep deprivation, maintaining functional homeostasis within a degraded but stable envelope. Permanent damage indicators absent. No theoretical explanation available within current xenobiological framework. Day 7, monitoring window, 184 hours. She sang, not loudly and not in any emotional or distressed register. She sat on the floor in her cross-legged posture, and she sang something, a human melody, low, structured, measuring itself carefully for approximately 20 minutes. I could not capture clean audio because the white noise suppression is calibrated for the frequency band of typical speech. What I recovered was fragmentary. The melody was not a lament. It was not desperate. It had a slow, cyclical structural quality, a phrase repeated with variation, built on, returned to, the way you build something out of a finite set of materials. I could not identify it in any cultural database I could access, which might mean it was composed by her, in the cell, during the preceding days. Or it might mean it was something she had known for years and chose to use now. I have no way to determine which. She sang for 20 minutes, then she was quiet for a while, then she began her circuit. I have thought about this entry more than any other in the record, and I want to set down what I was thinking when I watched it, because I believe it is relevant to the recommendation at the end of this document. The isolation protocol works by removing all external input so that the mind turns inward on itself. The design premise is that this inward turn is destabilizing, that the mind, stripped of external support, finds itself thin and frightened and insufficient, that a mind meeting only its own raw processes will recognize them as inadequate and begin to fragment, that the interior for any mind is not enough. Watching her sing to herself on day 7 at 184 hours, I considered the possibility that this design premise is not universal, that the assumption the interior is not enough does not apply to every architecture of mind equally. That for some minds, for this mind, at minimum, the interior stripped of external support is not a void. It is a space, and in a space you can do things, you can build things, you can sing. I don't know what she found in those 184 hours of silence. I know she was not destroyed by it. I noted, subject sang for approximately 20 minutes, regulated affect, purposeful structure, no dissolution present, no fragmentation. Assessment. The protocol's core mechanism, sensory removal producing inward cognitive destabilization, may not function as designed in human neurological architecture. Day 8, monitoring window, 208 hours. She was in the borderland. She was on the sleeping surface, entirely still, eyes closed, breathing in the long, slow pattern of near rest. She was not asleep. The biometrics confirmed it, and the floor stimulation was still functioning. But she was in the narrow state between wakefulness and sleep, the borderland where consciousness pulls back from active processing without descending into the sleep cycle. In most species, the floor stimulation makes this borderland inaccessible. The current is calibrated to prevent exactly this state, to pull the subject back into full wakefulness before they can settle even into light sleep. She appeared to have found a way to stay in it. Through whatever combination of physical position and respiratory control and deliberate management of her own arousal level, she had found the frequency the cell would allow her, and she was using it. Her markers were slightly improved from day 7. Not dramatically, not in any way that returned her to baseline. She remained measurably exhausted, and the exhaustion was real and accumulating. But slightly improved, as if whatever she was doing in the borderland was returning to her some small fraction of the recovery that full sleep would have returned more completely. Enough to continue, not enough to recover, but enough. I noted, subject has identified and is exploiting a recovery state available within the protocol's constraints. The protocol prevents sleep. It does not prevent this borderland state, which may provide partial neurological recovery insufficient for full restoration but sufficient to sustain function. This is not a mechanism I was aware of. I am not certain any prior subject has had the physiological management skill to exploit it. Day 8, second monitoring window, 222 hours. She had a hallucination. I could see it in her behavior, a period of approximately 7 minutes during which she responded to something that was not in the cell. She turned her head to track it, spoke 2 or 3 words, moved toward the wall as if something had appeared there. Then she stopped. She went very still for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor, put her face in her hands, and held that position for approximately 30 seconds. When she raised her head again, her expression had shifted back toward the composed, neutral register I had come to recognize as her baseline state. She had frightened herself, and then she had returned. I want to record what this comparison means because it is stark. In Kavith subjects, the onset of hallucination is not an episode, it is a threshold crossing. It is the point of no return in the dissolution sequence. A Kavith subject who begins hallucinating does not recover from it without external intervention. The hallucination marks the moment the mind's capacity to distinguish experience from non-experience collapses, and once that collapse begins, it does not reverse spontaneously. The subject is past dissolution. The interview can proceed. She sat with her face in her hands for 30 seconds and raised her head. I noted, transient perceptual disruption episode, approximately 7 minutes duration. Subject self-corrected to functional baseline without intervention. The disruption does not appear to have triggered cascade deterioration. It was an episode, not a threshold crossing. Her self-correction was systematic. She recognized the disruption, stopped moving, grounded herself through a physical position that eliminated sensory input from the environment and returned. She managed it. Day 9. Morning monitoring window, 232 hours. She looked worse, and I am going to record this with precision because the honesty matters. By day 9, the accumulation was visible on her body, in a way it had not been on day 3 or day 5. There was an unevenness to her movement that had not been present before, a fractional extra care, a slight deliberateness in the placement of each step, as if she were navigating her own locomotion with slightly more conscious attention than it normally required. Her eye focus, when the camera caught her face, was less crisp than it had been in the early monitoring windows. The speed of her circuit had slowed somewhat from day 6. She was carrying 9 days in a way you could see. And yet she was there, on her feet, moving around the cell with direction. Her lips were moving in the way I had come to recognize as her thinking through something mode, the small, deliberate pulse, one syllable at a time. I want to be precise about what this record documents, because I think the precision is the only honest way to characterize it. She was not well at day 9. The protocol was not without effect. The sleep deprivation was real, and its effects were real, and they had been accumulating for 232 hours. She was tired in a way that was no longer invisible. She was also still there, still standing, still thinking. I noted, subject shows visible fatigue markers for the first time in this record. Continued functional assessment positive. Dissolution indicators remain absent. She is impaired. She is functional. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and I do not have a framework that accommodates both being true at once. Day 9. Final monitoring window and cell entry, 246 hours. I authorized the cell entry myself. Standard protocol says cell entry occurs after dissolution is confirmed. You enter to retrieve a dissolved subject, begin the recovery sequence, prepare them for the interview. You do not enter an active cell. I had never, in 41 administrations, entered a cell that was still in protocol. I authorized entry at 246 hours because 9 days had passed. My secondary review request had not received a response. The medical officer had no explanation. The protocol had produced no dissolution at any point in its progression, and I needed to make a determination about what happened next. I could not make that determination from an observation station. I needed to speak to her. I put on the environmental suit, standard contamination protocol for all cell entries, and I went through the lock. She was standing. She was in the center of the cell, weight distributed evenly, hands loose at her sides, her posture carrying the exhaustion I had seen in the morning window but not buckled by it. Her face was toward the door. She had been watching it, or she had heard the lock cycling. Her expression was neutral and patient, in the specific way that patience is a form of management, something being kept, not something being felt easily. I stopped inside the door. We looked at each other. Then she said, in a voice that was flat and even and moderately precise, "Are you here to ask your questions or just to look?" I had not prepared for the conversation to begin on her terms. In 41 cell entries, the subject had never been capable of beginning the conversation on their own terms. I stood for a moment in the space between her question and my answer. I said, "I am here to conclude the assessment." She said, "All right." I said, "Are you?" and stopped. In every previous cell entry, this question was medical in a simple clinical sense. What needs addressing? What is the immediate status? I was trying to ask something different. I said, "How are you?" She looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, something that combined what appeared to be weariness with what appeared to be a dry, contained amusement. After a moment she said, "Tired, hungry, I'd like water." I provided water through the standard dispensing point. She drank it steadily and completely, not frantically but without waste, and then held the empty container for a moment before setting it down. I said, "You have been awake for 246 hours. She said, "I know." I said, "That is approximately 10 days and 6 hours. She said, 10 days and 6 hours approximately. I lost precise count somewhere around day 8. My reference points were irregular. I said, "You were counting days." She said, "I was tracking time. I used the food deliveries as reference points, but they were irregular, so my count accumulated some uncertainty. I estimated I had been in here between 9 and 11 days. 9 to 11. I said, "Why were you counting?" She looked at me with the same quality of expression. Then she said, "Because I needed to know how long I'd been in here, and because keeping count gave me something to maintain, something that required updating." She set down the empty container. "Is that surprising to you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "In every previous case I have documented with this protocol, by this point in the process, the subject is," and I stopped again, finding the characterization difficult to state plainly to someone who had not experienced dissolution. I said, "Not capable of the conversation we are having." She said, "How long is the protocol designed to take?" I said, "The standard window is 72 hours. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the wall. Then she looked back at me. 3 days. I said, "Yes." She said, "And I've been in here for 10. I said, "Yes." She said, a pause, a thought completed or set aside. "What happens now?" I said, "I am not certain what happens now." She nodded, as if this was a reasonable answer, as if uncertainty from an assessor at the end of a failed 10-day protocol was a thing she could accept and move around. She showed no anger about it, no triumph, no relief, just the same contained patience. I said, "Do you need medical attention, beyond rest?" She said, "I need sleep." She looked at me. "I know that's circular." I said, "Yes." She said, "Then I need sleep. After that I can answer your questions." I left the cell. I filed the deactivation order for the floor stimulation. I authorized the medical officer's 6-hour assessment window. I sat at my observation station for a considerable time looking at the empty monitoring display. Then I opened this record document and began to write. Here is what I have concluded from 9 days of observation, and I will state it as clearly as I know how. The isolation protocol functions by doing 2 things simultaneously. It removes every external reference point the mind uses to anchor itself in time, space, and the continuity of experience. and it prevents the neurological repair that sleep provides, degrading the mind's coherence until continuity fails. These two mechanisms compound each other. Disorientation accelerates degradation. Degradation amplifies disorientation. And together they produce dissolution reliably and within a predictable window. The protocol's foundational assumption is that both of these mechanisms are universal, that no mind can orient itself without external anchoring, that no nervous system can sustain cognitive function through extended sleep deprivation, that the interior, stripped of the exterior, is insufficient. For 11 species across 41 administrations, that assumption holds. For the human, I can now report from direct evidence that it holds only partially, and that the partial failure is enough to make the protocol non-functional. On the first mechanism, she lost some temporal anchoring. She admitted her day count became uncertain around day 8, but she did not lose the framework. She maintained an estimated count, flagging its uncertainty, using the only data available to her. When I told her the actual duration, her estimate 9 to 11 days encompassed the true figure. The sensory uniformity of the cell damaged her clock. It did not stop it. She had built a secondary clock from imperfect materials and continued to run it. On the second mechanism, she is measurably, biochemically, genuinely exhausted. The sleep deprivation is real. Its effects are real. The hallucination on day 8 was real. The visible fatigue on day 9 was real. The unevenness in her movement was real. But she remained cognitively functional for 10 days. Impaired and depleted and carrying every hour of it but functional, able to reason, able to count, able to plan and conserve and adapt and manage her own condition from the inside, able to sing. What I cannot determine from this record is whether there is an upper limit, whether at 12 days or 15 or 20, the human nervous system would arrive where every other nervous system arrives at 3. I did not run the protocol to that length, and my recommendation below addresses why I am not recommending that anyone do so. What I know is that at 10 days and 6 hours, she was standing in the center of the cell with her weight balanced and her hands loose, asking whether I had come to ask questions or simply to look. Addendum, formal recommendation. I am recommending, with the firmest language available to a Field Grade 4 officer, that the isolation protocol be suspended from application to human subjects pending full xenobiological review by a qualified specialist team. The protocol is designed to produce one outcome, dissolution, leading to a cooperative interview state within a 72-hour window. On human subjects, in the single case I have directly administered, it did not produce this outcome. It produced 9 days of inconclusive observation during which the subject conducted her own internal activities, maintained her cognitive organization, adapted to the protocol's mechanisms, and arrived at the interview in a state of her own choosing rather than one the protocol created. The resource expenditure calculation is straightforward. 9 additional days of facility capacity, monitoring staff time, medical oversight, and supply allocation beyond the designed window produced 0 movement toward the designed outcome. If the protocol does not work on this species within its design parameters, running it longer is not a solution to that failure. It is an extension of that failure. But the resource calculation is not why I am filing this recommendation with the urgency level I am assigning to it. The protocol is designed to make a subject stop thinking. That is its function. After 10 days of application, this subject was still thinking. She had spent 10 days in a cell containing nothing except herself, and she had used the time. I do not know what arguments she was building during those hundreds of hours. I do not know what she concluded. I do not know what she arrived at the interview having already worked through. I know that when I walked into that cell, she was ready for the conversation. The isolation protocol removes everything from a subject's world except the interior of their own mind. For every species I have previously applied it to, that interior, stripped of external support, is not sufficient. It is too dependent on the external world to maintain itself alone. The subject falls through the bottom of their own mind. For this subject the interior was sufficient. Not pleasant, she was exhausted. Not easy, she had to manage herself with constant deliberate effort, but sufficient. She had enough interior landscape to inhabit for 10 days without losing herself in it. The protocol uses emptiness as the instrument of destruction. It found in this subject a mind that could live in emptiness. I do not have a recommendation for what to use instead. That is beyond my grade and outside my assignment. What is within my assignment is the record of what I observed and the conclusion it compels. End of record. Sarat Divan Olam, Field Grade 4, Processing Station Vorith 9. Filed under restricted access by order of this assessor, pending command review. The subject slept for 14 hours. When she woke, she ate a full meal. Then she was brought to the interview room and she sat across a table from me, and she answered every question I asked. She answered them clearly, completely, and without hesitation, and several of her answers were of significant intelligence value, and I have filed those separately in the classified operational record under a different access tier. At the end of the interview, when all the operational questions had been asked and answered, when I had closed my notation log and was preparing to conclude the session, she said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "You can ask." She said, "The room they put me in, the no sound, no dark, no time room, what is it designed to do?" I said, "It is designed to produce a cooperative interview state in the subject." She said, "By making them break down." I said, "Yes." She thought about this for a moment. Her hands were flat on the table's surface. She looked at them, then at me. She said, "How long does it usually take?" I said, "The standard window is 3 days." She held eye contact for a moment. Her expression did not change in a large way. There was something in it that I could not name precisely, not pride, not contempt, not satisfaction. Something smaller than all of those. Something quiet. Then she said, "I thought the floor felt weird." She stood. The guard returned her to standard holding. I sat at the table after she left and did not move for some time. 3 days. I thought the floor felt weird. That is the last line of this record. I have no different way to end it. Secondary note, filed concurrent with primary record. I want to add something to this record that does not fit neatly into the day-by-day log format, but that I believe is relevant to any future command review of this case. It concerns the nature of my own error over the course of the 9 days I have described above, because I think the error itself is instructive, and I do not want it to be invisible in the record. When the isolation protocol was explained to me during my initial training as a field assessor, the instructor used a phrase I have thought about many times since. He said, "The protocol finds the part of the subject that is only held up by the world." He meant it as a clinical description of the mechanism. The protocol removes the world, and the parts of the mind that depend on the world for their coherence collapse without it. What remains, stripped of that scaffolding, is insufficient to maintain the whole. The subject dissolves. I believed this was a description of minds, of all minds, of the fundamental architecture of consciousness under any conditions sufficient to produce cognition. What I observed across 9 days is that it is a description of minds the institution has encountered before. It may be a universal truth. It may be a description derived from an insufficient sample. I have administered the protocol to 11 species. 11 is not the complete set of possible minds in the universe. It is 11. I knew this in an abstract sense before this case. I did not know it in the way that matters. The first monitoring window I logged at 18 hours, I noted. Protocol proceeding normally. I meant it. There was nothing at 18 hours that suggested otherwise. The second monitoring window at 36 hours, I noted. Early stage, 1 indicators possible. I was reading her movement as agitation, because movement at that stage in other species is agitation. I had no other template. By 68 hours, when I heard her reasoning through an argument at the edge of what my audio capture could reach, I knew something was different. But I still filed the secondary review request rather than making a determination myself, because making a determination would have required me to say, this protocol is not working on this subject, and here is what that means. I was not ready to say that. I had 41 successful administrations behind me. I had a 100% success rate as an established fact in my professional record. It is difficult to look at an established fact and identify it as a specific rather than a universal. By day 5, when I watched her lying on the sleeping surface and threading the needle between wakefulness and the borderland the floor stimulation would allow, I knew the protocol was not going to work on the design timeline. What I did not yet know, what I was still hoping was not true, was that it was not going to work at all. I kept extending the observation windows. I kept waiting for the break. On day 7, when she sang, I understood what the break was not going to come. I understood it, and I wrote the entry about the design premise possibly not applying to human neurological architecture. And then I went home and slept and came back the next morning and logged a standard monitoring window. I am noting this sequence because I think it matters for any institution that uses this protocol on this species in the future. The failure of the protocol on this subject was visible by day 5. It may have been visible, in retrospect, by day 3. The additional 4 to 6 days I ran, it were not information gathering. They were an assessor who had been taught that a tool always worked and was not willing, until the evidence was completely unmistakable, to conclude that it didn't. 41 successful administrations taught me that the protocol works. One subject taught me that the phrase, the protocol works, contains a hidden limitation I had not seen. I have not filed this note in the main operational channel because I do not have authorization to make institutional recommendations at that level. I am filing it here, in this restricted record, so that it exists somewhere for someone with the authority to act on it. If the protocol is deployed again against a human subject, the institution will know from this record what to expect. It will expect 9 days of a subject who uses the protocol's silence to think. It should not deploy the protocol again against a human subject. The world this protocol removes, the world any subject depends on to hold themselves together, is not for the human the same world it removes from everyone else. The other 11 species I have processed through this cell needed the world to be there. They were made of the world in the sense that their coherence depended on it. The human I observed for 9 days appeared to carry her world with her, not comfortably, not without cost, but with her. She sat in a room designed to be nothing, and she made it into something. Not much, a place to think, a place to count, a place to sing, a place to wait, but something. The protocol could not remove what she had brought into the cell with her, because what she had brought in was herself. I have no institutional language for that. I have only this record and the standing recommendation to suspend the protocol, and the memory of her looking at me across that interview table with something quiet in her expression that I still cannot name precisely. 3 days, she heard me say, and then I thought the floor felt weird. I have submitted the formal recommendation through standard channels, and I do not expect a rapid response. I understand that command will want to review this record in full before any determination is made, and I understand that a single anomalous case, even a case as thoroughly documented as this one, may not be sufficient to change an institutional protocol that has functioned reliably across 11 species. I accept that. I am not asking for an immediate decision. I am asking for the record to be read. I am asking for whoever reads this to sit with the number 9, not 72 hours, not the standard window, 9 days, and then to ask themselves what that number means for how this institution understands the thing it has been applying a 72-hour protocol to. There is nothing more to add. SD Olam Field Grade 4.